So, without further ado, the floor is yours, Sasha.
Alrighty. Well, let me start by first saying I think it's really easy to have kind of a false dichotomy, friends and enemies, what have you. And I don't want anything that I'm about to say to be taken to sort of pigeonhole Rob into sort of a category that he's not necessarily in. And I say that because this debate over broadband speeds and pricing and availability is, in my mind, kind of the telecom equivalent of the debate over global warming. The preponderance of evidence is completely overwhelming. And it's this, it's that the US had been a decade and a half, 2 decades ago, number one, period, on every measure you could possibly come up with in terms of broadband, speeds, pricing, availability, access, etc. And we're no longer that number one. We're not leading the charge. We're not far back. We're not, at the back of the class. But we're middling. And depending on who you ask, it's somewhere between, if you're looking at country by country, the high end might be 8 to 12th place, down to 30-odd place. And that's a real problem. And so faced with this kind of tsunami of data, verifying that we're kind of middling, and the fact that these data keep coming up again and again and again, and year after year after year, documenting this, I feel that opponents of that fact muddy the waters. And it's done in a way that really takes away from what is overwhelming scientific evidence to the contrary. It's, in essence, it becomes this ever-shifting array of counterpoints to explain, well, it's not quite like that takes time to refute and ends up not holding water at all in the first place. So I'm not saying the US is last place, but I am saying that we're sort of scoring the gentleman's C in broadband pricing, availability, adoption. And whereas this gentleman's C would have been okay, maybe in prior generations, now, today, in this 21st century economy, this lackluster performance is absolutely crushing. And Rob's shop has come up with a number of really interesting analyses looking at innovation in the United States. I think at one point we were actually dead last, right? It was like 41 of 41 countries that you had studied in terms of innovation. I suspect that progress in innovation, yeah. It's very hard to get to the forefront of that when the core element of a 21st century economy is not keeping up with the folks that are setting the curve. And our shop, the American Foundation, the Open Technology Institute, has documented this quite a bit. Before I came to Washington, D.C. in 2007, I worked for CADA, the Cooperative Association for Internet Data Analysis, at the San Diego Supercomputing Center, documenting, again, the same thing. But it's not just us. It's the OECD, it's Ofcom, it's the ITU, it's Cisco, it's Ookla, it's Akamai, it's Measurement Lab, it's even the FCC, all agree that our broadband speeds in the United States have been stagnant vis-a-vis how other countries around the globe are doing. Now, 5 years ago, Vince Cerf and I helped create something called Measurement Lab. And today, this broadband measurement platform is the largest open data repository on the planet. We just surpassed 800 terabytes of broadband measurement data, all freely available to anyone under a Creative Commons 0 license. This means you can do anything you want with these data. Everything on it is open source, every tool is open source, all the methodologies are peer-reviewed by scientists around the globe. It's open, 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 open. And everything we do is done to forward network research and science. I think that this also helps inform policymakers as well. And when you have 800,000 gigs of data, you can state pretty emphatically that this is not a fluke or some outlier, but rather the actual state of things. And for those that would say otherwise, we've said, well, look, just show us where we got this wrong. Show us where the preponderance, the consensus in the scientific community actually is incorrect. The people that have dedicated their entire lives, professional careers to broadband measurement, who agree that this is the way that we should be measuring these kinds of things. Where did they all go wrong? Now, we've recently also been looking at broadband pricing pretty extensively. And it turns out in the US we pay more for slower speeds in fewer locations than a growing list of other countries around the globe. And again, this is very bad if you're looking at what a 21st century economy needs to look like to remain globally competitive. And we've heard a lot of theories as to why that's happened, right? Population density is often one that's thrown around. And for each United States, for each Hong Kong, or for each South Korea, there's also a Sweden or an Australia. There's also, in our own backyard, a Canada, which has much lower population density than us and is doing better. Estimates are somewhere between, we're paying about $10, $15 on the low end per month more than other countries for the same service, to $20 to $30 on the high end. And what this translates to over the next decade is $250 billion. $250 billion in overpayments taken out of our pockets and put into the profits of some of these companies. I think we could do a lot with $250 billion in found money. And it points to a real failing that we're facing right now. So we've got this cost of connectivity report. There's a synopsis out there. I recommend anyone to look at it. We also release all of the data, every single bit of it that we used in our analysis, to anyone that wants it freely. It's on our website. You can download it, manipulate it however you want. But I think the take-home message is simply this. If you're looking at a 21st century economy, if you're looking at jobs, if you're looking at disposable income, if you're looking at innovation writ large, the notion that that isn't detrimentally impacted by having mid-lane connectivity is crazy. And I'll leave you with just a quick anecdote, which is Australia announced that they were investing $41 billion into their broadband infrastructure. Right about the same time that we invested $7 billion through the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program. So per capita, I just want to give you the stark relief. In Australia, per capita, they're investing $1,400 per man, woman, and child. In the US, we're investing $24. I don't see how you remain competitive with that. So I would argue that like electricity, like superhighways, railroads, public education, countries that ignore this fundamental, this foundation for 21st century economy are destined for decline.
Over to you, Rob.
Okay. Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I just want to clarify one thing that Sandra said. First of all, at ITF, we don't believe in global warming, nor do we believe in evolution. So just that tells you who we are right there. Look, there's two parts of this argument that are important to get right. One is this question of do we lead? And the second is, if we don't lead, why not? So I want to touch on both of those. I want to base it largely on a report that we released last year about this time called The Whole Picture, Where America's Broadband Networks Really Stand. It's on our website. So the first question is the analysis right that we don't lead? And Sasha bases much of his analysis on a New America Foundation OTI report, which he cited. And those reports are very hard to do. I readily admit that. It took a lot of legwork. You've got to call up all these ISPs or look online. But I will say, I think there are certainly a number of factual mistakes in that analysis that have been pointed out. Roz Layton, for example, who lives in Denmark and blogs for AEI, pointed out a number of mistakes, including underpricing. But I think the more serious two problems with the analysis of OTI, with Sasha's analysis, one is sample bias. The sample that they're looking at is largely urban ISPs in other countries. And these city comparisons are highly misleading because most of those ISPs are only serving those cities. You look at an ISP in New York like Verizon or Comcast or Time Warner or another city, they're serving the city, but they're also serving the suburbs, they're also serving the region. And that is a big, big difference. So for example, in the OTI report, they talk about a very innovative ISP in San Francisco that underprices the incumbents and gives higher speeds and lower prices of the incumbents as evidence that competition is a good thing. This is a San Francisco ISP called WebPass. Now, when you go and you look at the WebPass website, WebPass will sell you broadband if you live in the Bay Area, but only if you live in San Francisco, Emeryville, Oakland, or Berkeley. Only if you live in an apartment with 20 units or more, and only if the apartment has been built in the last 15 years. So in other words, WebPass is a cherry-picking ISP, CLEC. It just looks at the most sort of promising and lowest cost consumers, and it is able to provide lower prices because of that. He also looks at a company in the report called Sonic, which provides gigabit fiber in Petaluma. Unfortunately, it only serves 700 homes in Petaluma because those are the cheapest to serve. Can you imagine if an American ISP like Comcast said, oh, we're only going to serve Petaluma homes because they're the cheapest to serve, we're not going to serve all the rest. There's a recent study by Analysis Mason for the UK government that looked at the costs of putting fiber to every home in the UK. It's a very interesting study, and what they found was that the cost of putting fiber to London were about half of what the costs were to put it in the suburbs per home, and about a third of what they are to put it in the rural areas. So when you're an ISP that serves principally city dwellers, and that's all you're serving, which are a number of those sort of apples to oranges comparison in the OTI report, you're going to get a very misleading picture. The second problem is comparing apples to oranges in terms of service. So the OTI report, in fact, states, I believe in the appendix, it says, quote, as with telephone service, there is variation between television product packages offered by service providers. Some providers offer larger bundles of video channels than others, particularly in the US. This complicates comparisons. I would say that's a pretty significant understatement. It not only complicates comparisons, but it makes them almost impossible to do. When you're comparing a French ISP that has 12 TV channels to a US ISP that has 300, including ESPN, you're not going to get an apples-to-apples comparison. So where does the US actually stand in terms of broadband? We can look at a number of factors. Let me just look at three. One is adoption. And yes, we don't rank very well on adoption. In the OECD metrics that just came out, we ranked 16th. 19 percentage points behind the leader. Is that because we have bad networks, expensive networks? No. That is almost exclusively because we have among the lowest computer ownership rate in the OECD. Only Mexico and Greece are lower than us. So we have so many people in the US that don't even have a computer, they're not digitally literate, and they're not going to buy broadband. Now, if you just compare computer owners in the US to computer owners in the other OECD countries, we're only 4 percentage points behind the leader. Let's look at speed. As I mentioned, OTI, what OTI does in their study to compare speeds of their ISPs to our ISPs is they look at advertised speeds on the website. There's one big problem with that. The European Commission just came out with a report that found, using SAMNO's data, that Europeans on average get 75% of the speeds that are advertised. So the Commission writes, and France, by the way, that's only 40%, in the UK it's 45%. So they can say, hey, we're selling you 40 megs, but we're actually in France, if you're in France, you're getting about 16. The Commission writes, quote, this compares poorly to the USA's average of 96% of advertised download speeds. So the advertised download speeds in the US are pretty close to what you actually experience as a user, but at least in Europe they're very, very low. So again, comparing that is very misleading. Secondly, it's not really accurate to look at a few cities and look at speed data, because broadband users are across the entire country. So when you look at the data there where you look across the entire country, you get, I think the best data are the Akamai data. In fact, the new report for Akamai, Q3 2013, just came out this morning. And under that data, we continue our rank of 8th in the world in terms of broadband speeds. Yeah, I agree with Sasha, that's not number 1, but it's not bad. In fact, on that we had faster progress over the last calendar year, 4 quarters in Akamai than the average. When you look at high broadband, in other words, consumers who are using fast broadband, we rank 10th there, but we were in the top 4 in terms of rate of progress. So we are in the top 10 on fast broadband and broadband speeds, and we're making fairly good progress. Let's look, by the way, at where some of these other countries in the European Union do, who are involved in an unbundling regime, which Sasha supports, saying that it's the way to get competition and better networks. France, 34th in broadband speeds. Italy, 48th. Germany, 27th. UK, 14th. So we're ahead of all of these European countries in broadband speed. Now, what about price? Well, if you look at the ITU data, the United States ranks 3rd lowest in broadband prices in the world for entry-level introductory broadband, which I would argue is really the most important price point you want to get. You want low prices for entry-level people to get them engaged. There's an ITU study that looked at what's called the wired broadband basket. What is the price that consumers pay in countries as a share per capita GDP? The prices in Japan are 40% higher than in the US, 60% higher in Hong Kong, Singapore and the Netherlands, 80% higher in France, and 120% higher, 300% higher than in Korea. So at least according to this ITU data, US prices are actually quite competitive. FCC International Broadband Report, looking at their price data, they have a number of different sort of price plans. But one I thought that was striking, if you get a tablet plan in the US for an an iPad, for example, or an Android device, or you get one in Japan, you're going to pay 6 times more per megabit in Japan than you do in the US, 11 times more in Hong Kong. So, what's really going on there? To the extent that we're not number 1, and we aren't, in virtually any measure, why aren't we number 1? There's really only 3 explanations. One explanation is these companies are inept. They don't know what they're doing. Okay, obviously, we can reject that. These companies, if they have inept managers, their shareholders will force them out. The second would be profits, and Sasha alluded to that. He said there's essentially at minimum $250 billion of excess profits. So why don't we look at that? Well, we have actually looked at that, and if you look at the Bloomberg data on profits, you find, for example, that the darling of a lot of folks who are on the sort of unbundling world is Free, an ISP in Paris. The average profit rate for Free is 4 times higher than the average profit rate of an American ISP. In the Netherlands, again, another model of unbundling, profits in the Netherlands are higher. In fact, US ISPs on average have profit rates of about 1/4 of European ISPs. This, to me, is not evidence of market power. One last point on this. If these companies in the US are profit hungry who skimp on capital expenditures and want low speeds and force people to pay more, you would expect that the capital expenditure to operating revenue ratio would be very low. In other words, very few capital expenditures, lots of operating ratios. In fact, you find the exact opposite. The US has, compared to other countries, we're about 25 to 30 percentage points better on that in terms of CapEx ratios to revenues. Last point would be, if these companies are private sector monopolists who are profit hungry, why do we see in the OTI report that the municipal providers are also don't rank very well? We would imagine that these municipal providers like Lafayette, Louisiana, Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Bristol, Virginia would be right at the top of the world in terms of pricing, and they're not. They rank 31st, 44th, and 57th, respectively. They essentially rank more or less where US ISPs are if you control for them. So what's really going on there? Sasha dismisses density, but you cannot dismiss density. We are the 2nd least densely populated metro in our cities. Not talking about the entire country, but our cities are the second least densely populated of any country other than Australia. And that raises costs quite significantly. And lastly, we don't have subsidies. I think maybe that's where Sasha and I would agree that we do think that more subsidies would be better. Tax incentives for build-out, more subsidies for rolling out in rural areas. But you look at other countries, they are significantly, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Swedes, Singapore, have used much more public subsidies to get that. That's not included in the price data, if you will. So I will stop there saying that I think it's a much more complicated picture than Sasha would have us believe. I think we're doing actually quite well, and when you factor in some of the real challenges here that we have, other countries don't have, I would say we're doing quite well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rob. Let me start off some questioning by framing things in terms of if I'm a legislative aide to a member of the House or the Senate, and he or she has sent me up to this session to come back with a memo that yields where do we stand, sort of answer to that question, where do we stand internationally? And he would have listened to this discussion, and he would have been pretty discouraged because he doesn't really have a clear memo to write in terms of where things stand. What if the aide was very clever and thought, well, I'm going to just turn the issue around a little bit to my boss and say, they couldn't arrive at any sort of consensus, but what we have to start doing is thinking about going forward the kinds of metrics we need to have in order to make broadband policy going forward. Some of them are going to be the metrics we talked about for sure, but we did have in the net neutrality order that the court handed out a few weeks ago, this charge to the FCC that essentially you don't have many pillars, but one pillar you do have is transparency. And we're in a world where people have multiple devices with multiple network access plans to get online, and transparency, in a sense, becomes a lot more urgent going forward than it has been in the past couple of years. Do we need to think anew about the metrics we need to collect in order to make transparency meaningful in a regulatory framework that is likely to lean on that more than it has in the past? Anybody want to take up that?
I can. I don't think we do, actually. I think we have some of the most transparent data of any country. There was a period there where we were with the exception of us in the UK, we were the only ones publishing the SAMNOS data. And as I mentioned, that's the data on looking at actual speeds compared to advertised speeds. So those data are published. We know what they are. We have good data generally on speeds from Akamai. And we have good data from from NTIA on take-up and adoption. I guess I would just say if there were a Hill staff figure writing a memo, the memo I would write would be, let's focus on the real issues in the U.S. and not get sidetracked into this issue, which is fundamental. What this issue is about is are these markets competitive enough? I don't think that's really, I think to me that is a giant diversion, and it diverts us from what we should be doing. The single most important thing we should be doing is we should be setting a national goal of getting 95% of all Americans online with reasonable broadband and high levels of digital literacy. That's what's holding us back, much more than, you go to Finland, you go to Sweden, those countries, you're talking virtually 100% digital literacy. We're much, much lower than that. That's our big challenge. It's not, our problem in the U.S. is not networks, it's users. Users who don't have the money. We have a high level of poverty in the U.S. And I think that this whole debate diverts us from that key question.
So I guess I fundamentally disagree on this. We are in desperate need of additional transparency around the terms and variables being used in terms of the data that's being collected and made publicly available. The SAMNOS data is good going in, and the results bad going out. And I can say that definitively because, I don't know if Rob knows this, but SAMNOS uses Measurement Lab to collect its data. And then through a series of methodological shifts, drops over 1/3 of their sampling in order to provide an optimal view of the broadband speeds that you receive. And via that, the methodology for MLab data that's collected that doesn't go through this shows speeds that are 1/3 the speed of what's reported of MLab data via SAMNOS after this methodological shift, i.e. the FCC report speeds that are 300% faster than MLab, and are about 300% faster than Akamai, Ookla, Cisco, and anyone else is measuring this. So either everyone got this wrong, where you have to really look at the fine print and what's being reported. As another example, it's interesting, one of the little blurbs that one of my staff put together is, I'll just read it to you. Quote, many of the counterpoints industry folks make is that the affordability of entry-level broadband plans as found by the ITU. And that's the point that Rob made. Let me continue that quote. Quote, for the last 8 years, the ITU has defined broadband as 256 kilobits per second. So Rob's absolutely correct in what he's reported. And this definition of broadband, 256 kilobits per second, and lumping all of that together for a comparison, and you say, we're doing pretty well, because by that measure, the US is, I forget if it was 4th or 8th or something like that, really obfuscates, it hides what's really happening. So MLab collects uploads and download speeds, latency and jitter, and then 150 other variables. And this is useful for a variety of different things. My first chief technologist, Rob Topolsky, was the one that caught Comcast blocking BitTorrent. Today there's a gentleman in the audience about halfway back there that's studying what is Iran doing to block content and using MLab data to look at filtering and other malfeasance of that sort. It's a way for us to look at deep packet inspection. It's a way for us to look at peering and interconnection. It's a way for us to exploitate what's actually happening online, which is often completely hidden from public view. The FCC today does not collect any pricing data that's made publicly available. Think about that. Like, how can we effectively know what the costs are for services in the United States if we refuse to do that? The Form 477 data, the best data set that we have in terms of where broadband actually is in the United States, is not released publicly. I have to ask, why is that? And so groups like OTI, Measurement Lab, researchers around the globe are constantly saying we need more data made available, more data collected, more data analyzed to get a better picture for what's happening. And in the interim, according to the best available data we have, the U.S. is not doing well.
Could I ask a question about this methodological jujitsu that Samnos does? Because you're throwing out a third of your data for reasons that seem to be about making themselves look fundamentally different. I'd be curious to know what they're doing and why.
I'll give you 2 examples that have shifted some but are still part of this. So one was they originally they Winsorized the data by dropping the 10% of the fastest speeds that were measured as part of one broadband test into a series and iteration of a bunch of different measurements. They dropped the fastest 10% and the slowest 30%, and then average what's left. Well, it doesn't take a statistical genius to understand exactly what that does to your data set. Second, over latency and jitter, they would do a series of 10 measurements. And they wouldn't even average anything. They would take the lowest latency, round trip time, and report that as your latency. So i.e., your best of 10 is reported to you as what you're actually receiving. And in a space whereby that then gets reported as our official speeds, right? You know, the FCC is reporting that people are getting their broadband speeds. The advertised speed is what you receive. Except when you talk to anyone, they're like, well, I don't seem to actually get my broadband speed. What's going on here? It's not you. It's a methodological bias that over-reports broadband speeds. And it's systematic and a part of the way in which we pretend like we're doing better than what we actually are.
So there's a couple of responses. So you're basically implying that Samnos is being unethical at worst and obfuscation at best.
I'm saying the fine print is really what matters.
Yeah, I would love to have a San Luis person respond to that because this is a company whose entire business model is based upon being able to sell accurate data. Either they're manipulating the U.S. and not Europe in your view, or they're manipulating both. And if they're manipulating both, then why are we much better than Europe, as Neely Kroes has acknowledged? Second point on the pricing issue. If you look at there are two measures that ITU uses. One is on entry level, the other is on broadband basket, which is as the term would imply, is a basket of broadband services. And those were the data that I also provided. And on that measure, the basket of broadband services, we are half the price of many countries around the world as a share per capita GDP. You mentioned there's no price data. The OECD has price data on their website, on their broadband portal, which is quite good. You mentioned latency. Actually, Akamai reports latency, and our latency is in the ballpark of other countries. It's not far off. And lastly, on pricing, I would encourage you to look at a study by Yochai Benkler recently that we cited. And Benkler looked at prices on a variety of different speeds in various countries. And what he found was that American prices tended to be progressive. In other words, if you look at sort of the average here, our low-end speeds were cheaper than other countries, and our high-end speeds were higher than other countries. I actually think that's exactly what you want as a country, because if you really, really want high speeds, you may have the ability, likely more ability to pay and more willingness to pay. But if you're somebody who's sort of more on the margin of whether you're going to be involved in broadband or not, if you can have a lower price to get on, that's a better system for the overall country. So again, you can pick various price things to make the point you want to make. I'm not really all that worried that our gigabit speeds are higher than the Netherlands' gigabit speeds. It's sort of equivalent to sort of comparing Ferrari prices around the world and saying that our Ferrari market is not very competitive. I don't think most people care. You look, for example, last year, middle of 2012, which were the last data we could find, for Chattanooga. So Chattanooga, by the way, Chattanooga built their network. A third of their capital costs were paid for by the federal government. So that's a nice leg up when you want to build a gigabit network. But in 2012, there were 12 people in Chattanooga who were subscribing to that gigabit network. 12. Again, there may be more now. But I think when you're at that level, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, less than 1% of Danish citizens, households, subscribe to broadband that's faster than 100 megabits. Well, less than 1%. So yeah, they have these networks over there, and most people don't use them because they don't have a need to use them. So again, it's like sort of comparing this Ferrari out there and go, geez, these countries have Ferraris. We don't have any Ferraris. That's because most people like driving Fords, and they're very happy with Fords, and Fords are actually pretty good cars.
Yeah, today's Ferraris, tomorrow's Camry. It's clear, right? We could have had the same discussion 10 years ago. You just would have said, nobody needs 10 megabit connectivity, and it would have been the same argument, the same logic. And my point is simply that we actually need these speeds at the same rates that other countries are putting them into place, because what becomes possible in places where faster speeds are available is not possible in places where it's not. And so if the notion is they're faster and we don't need that speed, I would caution against making that kind of our national stance towards broadband. We have thus far always proven to be incorrect in saying we don't need X when it comes to technology. You've got the Bill Gateses of the world, right, saying we need like five supercomputers, or maybe it was like 16 megs of RAM, or no one would ever need a hard drive that was a gig, or on and on and on. Broadband is, I think, very similar. I actually happen to have, and I'm happy to show anyone that wants this, part of the data set that we released, the actual costs of these services. We went and checked, I don't know how many scores of different plans, maybe a couple hundred. in total. What you see is, at least from 15 meg service and up, the US is paying 40 to a couple 100% more, whether you look at the average or the median in other countries. And that's across all these different tiers, 15 to 20 megs, 30 megs, 50 megs, 100 to 150 megs, and 1,000 megs. That, to me, is a pretty damning indictment at whatever level you're coming in. Now, maybe at 256 kilobits per second, they were paying less. But for speeds that matter across all these tiers, we're paying more, and that's a real problem.
So let me look, a couple of things.
We're going to let Rob go, then we're going to open up to some questions from the floor, since I see any.
Well, I'm happy to acknowledge that at some point, the speeds we all need will be more than 20 megs. That isn't the case today. And, you know, it'll continue, those speeds will continue to go up. And I don't think anybody can predict whether we will ever need a gig, and we may. But we also don't need a Ferrari now, and maybe in the future we will. We don't have car companies building Ferraris because in the future you might need it. Companies largely respond slightly ahead of market demand, which is how it should be. And again, I just go to this point, if these networks are so valuable, if these gigabit networks are so valuable, and I have to say, just the caveat being, I do think it's important to have gigabit test beds. That's a different issue, because you can develop new applications, see if they work, see if you need them. But to sort of imply that everybody today should have a gig, I think it's like, well, who's going to pay for that? Well, in Sasha's model, the profit maximizing selfish corporation will just pay for this out of lower profits, and we'll all get sort of a free lunch. This is actually not how it works. And again, I go back to this, that when less than 1% of the Danes are buying these services because they don't want them, that should send a pretty clear message. The second point is on Sasha's point about these price things. Again, I go back to my point. You look at most of the ISPs in his model, they are urban ISPs. They're not, and this is the fundamental difference between the US ISPs and these European urban ISPs. Comcast serves a wide variety of territories, and it largely charges the same price. And it, got to tell you, it probably loses money or doesn't make any money on some of those territories, and it makes a little more on some others, but on average, it all averages out. So you can't compare US ISPs to essentially urbanized, low-cost, high-density ISPs, which is what the OTI study does. And the last point, which I'll go back to, the fundamental argument that Sasha's making is that there is not enough market competition here, that these companies have too much market power, and they're charging prices that are 40 to 200% higher, which, as I said, is A, not true, and B, to the extent it's true, there's all these other factors. That should imply that their profits are 400 or 500% higher than European profits. And the evidence shows that they're not. The evidence shows that American ISP profits are lower than European ISP profits. So again, this is the key thing. If there is market power and price gouging going on, these profits should be enormous. Their stock should be going through the roof because they're just making massive profits off of the rest of us suckers out here. And the profit data simply don't support that. So where's all that money going?
We are going to turn to audience questions, and I have plenty of hands. I saw John Winhausen first, and then we'll move across this way. My one bit of encouragement is ask your questions as succinctly as you can so we can get as many questions as possible. John.
So, thanks, John. Just one comment to one question. I'll make them both quick, but I guess picking up on Sasha's comments about 1 gig and the debate over, we might be able to argue whether 1 gig is needed by a residential consumer or not, but from an anchor institution perspective, 1 gigabit is absolutely becoming valuable and necessary for schools, libraries, and healthcare providers to be able to carry on their business. So just one data point there, and I'd also suggest friendly advice to Rob. When he was chairman, Michael Powell got into some trouble by analogizing broadband to a Mercedes. as something you'd like to have. So I'm not sure the Ferrari example that you got in trouble with back then is going to be a good one for you.
I didn't say broadband. I said gigabit
You said 1
broadband.
gig. Okay.
Big difference.
All right. My question really is though about residential and picking up, Rob, on your comment about computer ownership in the United States being low. Perhaps only Greece and Mexico are behind us. Does that, and this is actually a question for all three of you. I'd love to get, John, your view as well from your research. Does that suggest that in order to increase residential broadband adoption, that U.S. policy should really try to promote greater computers and low-cost computers, and maybe vouchers or some subsidy program to increase the penetration of computers in the home as a way to stimulate broadband deployment and usage?
I would support that. We've supported that for many, many years. Some kind of low-income device support program, absolutely. Devil's in the details how you structure that, but I think that would be a good thing to do.
If you look at the data on barriers to broadband adoption, you see about, this is the 2010 study I did at the FCC, 36% of non-broadband users saying cost has something to do with why they don't have broadband, and that some of that has to do with high reconnection charges if they've had credit problems, but 15% say it's the cost. I think it's 50% who say it's the cost of the monthly service, 10% who say it's the cost of the computer. So clearly, you have to look at the adoption problem holistically. So computer access is part of it, so a coverage computer program is part of it. But I would caution against thinking, oh, we give people vouchers to get low-cost computers or set up some program to make that available. I would caution against thinking that will be the solution to the broadband adoption issue, because you do need to, at the same time, do the things that a lot of the BTOP funded programs have been doing, a lot of what other programs, whether it's Connected Compete or Internet Essentials, are doing. Attack the problem holistically, give people digital skills training as you give them some relief on the cost of access. You do really have to think that broadly about the problem.
I would just copy paste the research.
We have a gentleman here that I see, Matt, in the back. So the person with your hand up, get that hand back.
Right. Scott Smith from the State Department. I was in Japan a few years ago when the Recovery Act funds were allocated and there was discussion about broadband. Japan was one of the leaders of broadband speeds. And in talking with people in both government and private sector, there was discussion about, okay, so Japan was years ahead of us in pushing broadband out, but what do they have to show for it? How do we measure benefits in terms of people's lives, economy, those kind of things? And to Chairman Wheeler's comment this morning that beyond looking at broadband, we also need to think about what it enables. What metrics come next? Whether you're looking at broadband speeds or percentage of people who have access to it, in terms of people's lives and the benefits to us, what are the subsidiary metrics that we ought to consider, and how should we look at that or think about it?
Yeah, so Japanese made a clear policy choice back in the early 2000s. They were going to build it, and hopefully they will come. So they put in place incredible tax incentives for NTT to deploy fiber. They exempted it from unbundling. And it's also, we should remember, it's a lot easier to do that. Tokyo has 13 times greater density than, say, Cleveland or Chicago. So it's pretty cheap to do that in Japan. And I think you're right, the Japanese government has realized that that wasn't enough. So I think measures that one should look at are things like how much e-commerce is going on, how many e-services people are buying with that and using it. Are people using it for other things such as e-health and digital and distance education, things like that, which we measure somewhat in the U.S., but I think that actually is an area where I do think we need significantly better measures is on use. Because fundamentally, you're right. I mean, and then the other thing too, which we lose sight of, if all people are going to do on broadband is watch cat videos on YouTube, that's a fun thing and it's useful. I mean, it's entertainment. But I think what we need are better measures of the producer value, or what Topper would call the prosumer value of internet. not just the consumer value, if you will. So that would be things that I said, like how many people are using it for financial services, how many people are getting rid of their regular bank account and using online banking or online travel. These are the sorts of metrics that make a difference, or the fact activities that make a difference.
Yeah, and just to add to that, because you're raising a point I was going to make, which is you do have to start to think about what are the right outcome measures that stakeholders of all stripes are going to be interested in. And it goes to some of the things that Rob said. It also goes to building into programs metrics and the longitudinal design to see over time whether, as the chairman said this morning, people are using new applications in the educational space in ways that improves over time learning outcomes. Same thing with healthcare outcomes. That's a very different data collection problem. It's a very different research design problem. But I can tell you from having worked at the SEC on the broadband plan, bad data on those things will show up in people's speeches and in congressional testimony. And one would like to avoid that if at all possible, so that the metrics are speaking in a clear and credible way to outcomes that people care about. We have Matt, and then I see a question here in the front.
Yeah, just to Rob again, I'm always confused by the comparisons. I mean, not that the European comparisons are conclusive or decisive or anything, but I often hear that Europe is so far behind us that they have all these fiber networks nobody wants. And that seems to me to be something of a contradiction. Today it's a Ferrari in your comparison. And we hear that nobody really needs one of those things, but they're not building them in Europe fast enough either, because I've heard, they're not building fiber quickly enough in Europe. And yet people come out and they say, of course we don't need fiber. So are they getting it right in Europe, or are they somehow ahead of us and behind us at the same time, according to these measures that you're using? It seems like a lot of internal contradictions, maybe on both sides sometimes, but especially in what I've heard you say here today.
I don't think it is an internal contradiction. I think it's a question of sort of what level of granularity you're looking at Europe. So a lot of what the reports that want to show that we're falling behind will look at is they will look at particular cities in Europe that have deployed high-speed fiber. And on that level, yes, those cities have higher speeds than we do. But if you look at overall in Europe, the U.S. has significantly more fiber. First of all, we should recognize that fiber is only one technology. You have DOCSIS 3 and others. But just looking at fiber, we've got probably 20 times more fiber than France as a share of subscribers, significantly more than Germany. We even have more than the Netherlands, about the same as the Netherlands. So I don't think that's really quite the issue. Europe overall, I think this is one of the points that Neelie Kroes has made, is that they are having a problem because they don't reinvest that much. Our capital expenditure ratios as a share of GDP in the U.S. for the industry are significantly higher than European ISPs. The reason is that, and this is to me why this debate is so frustrating, is they just fundamentally have a different market structure. Most of those countries have only essentially the incumbent telecom DSL provider. They never sort of developed cable providers the way we did. And so they're sort of stuck with getting competition in an intramodal way. We've developed a different model, and I think this notion that every country should have the same model, regulatory model, I think is really missing the point. I'm very sympathetic to the French model. They don't have any cable companies to buy, really to speak of, so they're trying to do it through unbundling. But in any case, I think the key point is you want to be at that sweet spot where you're expanding your network capacity and speeds faster than where the consumer is, but not so fast to be out in Ferrari land.
I have a question here, then I'm going to go to this side of the room since I've been looking this way a lot. So Karen first.
So sort of an answer to your question about economic and social impacts. I work at NTIA. We're doing a study on a VTOP program. It's actually an external evaluator who's looking at economic and social impacts and how you might be able to measure outcomes in various arenas. So there's an interim report on our website that has they've done an extensive lit review of all these different studies that are out there, so I'd be happy to share that with anyone. The other point I would raise is a question, a challenge to us all, is not just to think simplistically of adoption as just having someone subscribe to broadband. There's really a much more complex problem to really find out if someone is able to use it effectively and to produce content as John mentioned. So I would just urge everyone to think of it as a much broader challenge than just getting someone
Other than bragging rights, what number one, two, three, four. I understand bragging rights, and I'm still confused about all that. A real question for me, answer that what you want, what I really want to know. If one will 4G, 5G, or whatever wireless we move towards to our range in the world, who will then start thinking about that?
Can you repeat the question, please?
The question is, what will 4 or 5G wireless access do to our ranking in the world?
Or the world ranking?
Or to the world rankings? Take a whack at it.
So we actually did comparative analysis of pricing on mobile as well, which you can download, and all the data is available for folks to mash up however you see fit. It's unlikely to meaningfully impact things, mainly because most wireless providers have data caps somewhere around 2 to 5 gigs. So to put that into perspective, you can watch one HD movie a month. And given the overage fees, your second one will cost you $40 to $60. That's about $10 per gig in overage. And what that means is it's not a functional equivalent between wireless and wireline. And that business model is not likely to shift. I wish it would. That'd be fantastic. It's not likely to shift anytime soon. But in terms of what beyond the bragging rights, the important thing, what I and my team are always looking for is what's coming. Right? What's happening in terms of the Internet of Things, of smart grids, of intelligent transportation, of next generation educational fare, 4D, HD, right? This is the next iteration. It's already hitting, the store shelves today. And what this means is a jump, a level of magnitude jump in the necessary infrastructure. You can't have intelligent transportation systems without a national fiber infrastructure to carry the critical information between vehicles. So you just can't get there from here. And so one of the reasons why we say we actually need to make this multi-$100 billion investment is because when you actually look at the return on investment for that, cars drafting behind cars, the elimination of congestion, this is a return on investment in a matter of a couple of years. But we have no plan to get there from here. We have no infrastructure that could get us there. So what's going to happen in places like Japan, where we haven't yet seen the fruits of that? But what we will see is that they'll be able to do things that are simply not possible in the United States. And if you don't think, well, wow, if you could just eliminate accidents for all intents and purposes, if you could have a far more structured and efficient transportation sector writ large that can move goods around in ways that we can't even possibly comprehend, if you can lower the cost of bringing goods to market by 5 or 10%, the global economy, that's the ballgame. And so what becomes possible in terms of what's next is incredibly different when you have slow broadband speeds, when you have broadband speeds that enable the kind of machine-to-machine communication we all know are coming fast.
So I've got a comment. Look, Internet of Things and ITS are incredibly cool technologies. They're incredibly important. We just wrote a big report on both of those topics. They're not big bandwidth users. They're just simply not. There's little sensor things sending out a couple of packets of data every little bit. And there's a few exceptions to that, but by and large, that's not going to drive. If we're saying that we need to have a massive $100 billion program, well, let's just say hypothetically we're going to pay for the public funds so that we can all watch 4D TV. I don't think most Americans would want their tax dollars spent on that. And so if they don't want their tax dollars spent on that, why would we want our consumer dollars spent on that? So the reality is, when you look at the Akamai data, I'm going to get it slightly wrong, but I think it basically, the report today said that we were expanding our speeds around 40% over a year-by-year basis. So that means that the networks are not stagnant. That means a doubling every 2 years.
And even if it's doubling every 3 years, that's pretty good. So there's no evidence that the networks are not keeping up with changing in society of new demands. There's no evidence of that. So yeah, I think the bragging rights would be if we were at the same kind of broadband network as Honduras or Algeria, that would be a big problem, because we would be our network would be so far behind what our needs are, what our demands are. But there's no evidence of that. Our needs and our demands and our networks are actually fairly well synced today. In fact, I would argue the networks are a little bit ahead of where our demands are today, and they don't show any evidence of falling behind that. So that's what matters, Gary, not whether you're number one.
We are going to take one or two more questions. We're at 2:15. We started a little bit late, but I'm going to ask this gentleman to be as succinct as possible so that we can possibly get one additional question. So go ahead, please.
My name's Will Reinhardt. This is for Sasha. What are our solutions? I mean, let's assume what you're saying is true. So what are your solutions?
I mean, there's a whole tool chest of solutions. You know, so I agree with Rob that locally owned networks, locally provisioned systems often can provide better service for cheaper prices. And that's why I'm for whatever gets that done. Like, I'm business model agnostic on that. So rolling back laws that prevent local service provision would be huge. It would have a meaningful impact on tens of millions of people's everyday lives. We've had a universal service fund in the United States for telephones. We've done that for decades because we understood the benefit to society writ large. We clearly need to do that. I would love to see, you know, a broadband technology opportunities program too, that invests in things. I mean, when people say we're doing okay, they clearly haven't been to Indian country. I have, and we're not doing okay. We're not doing okay in a lot of rural America. And without targeted investments in those spaces, you're basically writing off those communities and constituencies entirely from a 21st century economy. That's not okay. It's just not what you do in a civil society. And I think there's a lot to be left to markets. But I think there's a lot to be left to markets that are competitive, where the barriers to new entrants are as low as possible, if not non-existent. And when you look at international comparisons of where prices are cheaper, where speeds are faster, there are commonalities. And some of them are common carriage, some of them are unbundling. But overarchingly, it's that there is a push to ensure that you have multiple different options, multiple different tools to getting things done. In the US, we've been triangulating more and more on a singular kind of business model, a singular kind of solution that doesn't meet the needs of a number of different constituencies, a number of different communities. And we will suffer for that. We are suffering.
This will be
I just want to respond.
quickly, and then
So just a couple of points. I mean, Sasha's whole point, and much of the that sort of side of that argument says that the real secret sauce here, that sort of key that would turn everything on, is open access and unbundling. And that those countries, the ones that have those multiple business models, are in the lead. Okay. France ranks 34th in speeds in the Akamai data. We rank 8th. They have open access unbundling. Italy, 48th. Same thing. Germany, 27th. So the evidence suggests that that simply is not true. And here's why, I think it's really important, here's why this notion of that the solution is not local municipal provisioning. Because what will end up happening is the privileged local communities with high densities will be the ones that adopt this, and it'll be very, very similar to the Affordable Care Act risk, where the sick people sign on to insurance and the well people don't. And what you end up doing is driving up insurance rates for the rest of us. If you move to that model, what's going to end up happening is that broadband rates for people who live in low-income communities, who live in rural communities, will go through the roof, because all of the real cheap houses to serve, the ones with the high incomes, will have their own sort of gated red line networks. That's not the world that I want to live in. I love a world where we have sort of networks for everybody. What I would do, by the way, I agree with Sasha, by the way, I do think we need significantly more rural subsidies for the Indian reservations and others. I also think we need to extend first-year expensing for at least another 10 years, let these network rights write themselves off, and I think we need to focus on digital adoption. That's the key issue that is in the whole country.
We're going to let Rick be very succinct and responses be very succinct on the last question.
Sure, I would just encourage people to take a look at the MLabs and SAMNO's question. My understanding from our experts is only the top 1% and bottom 1% are thrown out. And there is some controversy about the routers supplied by one particular company, and I think the FCC, has resolved that controversy, but apparently not. So I'd ask people to take a look. But Rob, my question was going to be the same question Will asked, so you've kind of answered it. What you obviously have a rosier, in my opinion, more correct view, but to the extent solutions are necessary, what would they be?
Well, I think we've covered it. Just from a personal perspective, I'm all about doing more to get more people online to encourage broadband adoption. I do think digital skills, or what I call digital readiness, is going to be the next challenge, not just for non-broadband users, but for a lot of us who have lots of gear but won't know how to negotiate all sorts of new applications enabled by the Internet of Things. So I have taken the moderator's prerogative to have the last word, but let me also ask you to thank our panelists for their time and wisdom.